Hello everybody and welcome back. As always, I'm Mateo311 and this is your channel for everything VR related. So today, we're going over the best and the worst of VR. But to elaborate on that, this isn't just a list of the worst games and best games. I've done a million best games lists, and if we were talking about worst games, guys, there's so much junk out there, this list would go on forever, and it would honestly be like a waste of time. Instead, we're going to be talking about games or even hardware that tried to go big, tried to do something new, and ultimately failed, or on the opposite side of that, games that did go big and really succeeded. Now, if I miss anything along this list, please let me know what it is down in the comments. I love hearing your feedback. If you have any questions, obviously add that too. And let's not waste any time. There are, of course, the links and timestamps if you want to skip ahead, but before we jump in, this video is brought to you by my sponsor, Kiwi Design. Kiwi has accessories for all of your favorite headsets, and they finally started releasing some new products for the Quest 3. On screen, we have their brand new extra comfy Quest 3 Elite strap. I've been using head straps from Kiwi for years now, and they're hands down my favorite. There's a link to Kiwi down in the description, and don't forget to use discount code Mateo311 for 5% off and to help support my channel. Okay, so we're going to jump back and forth on this list between worst and best, and we're heading back to the days when the Oculus Studio was funding AAA developers for pcvr titles. One of the biggest games of this time was Medal of Honor Above and Beyond from Respawn. Unfortunately, to this day, I still consider this one of the biggest fails in VR history. Around this time period, Respawn showed that they knew how to make a truly compelling single-player campaign with both Titanfall 2 and Jedi Fallen Order. So when it was originally announced that Respawn was working on a VR game, I was absolutely hyped beyond belief. However, my disappointment started when they announced that this would be a Medal of Honor title. I would have much more preferred a Titanfall or Star Wars game, but I still had some pretty high hopes. During the development process, there were articles coming out discussing how they didn't want to make the game too realistic, leading to something like PTSD, but now in retrospect, those comments are laughable. When the game finally did release, not only was it a buggy mess, but that serious nature was nowhere to be found, and the title felt more like it was trying to be Inglourious Bastards without any of the charm and humor. The overall campaign was quite bland, motion controls, loading screens, and the overall pacing were just horrendous, and the online player base dried up almost immediately. Probably the most impressive aspect of this game was the fact that they were eventually able to get it to run on the Quest 2. Honestly, we would have been much better off with just a straight port of Titanfall 2 rather than a mediocre Medal of Honor title that didn't include any of the aspects that makes VR shine. On the complete opposite side of this, we have the AAA studio Insomniac Games, which knew how to show off the best aspects of VR. Locomotion is a key component to virtual reality games. Stormland had us climbing, gliding, and surfing across the planet with mechanics that just felt right in VR. It was a fairly polished release, unlike many other titles of its time, and it also delivered excellent combat, an intriguing storyline, and beautiful graphics. Now personally, Stormland isn't one of my favorite all-time VR games, but when it came to Meta funding a AAA flat-screen studio, Insomniac Games was easily one of the most successful. It was clear back in the day whenever a flat-screen studio got involved in VR, they were stumbling in the dark trying to get things to work right. Eventually, most indie developers surpassed AAA studios when it came to the basics like movement and motion controls, and honestly, they just seemed to care a lot more about the overall product. But getting back to Stormland and Insomniac Games, they were one of the only big-name studios that were able to deliver a solid product. Now jumping back to the fails, a lot of studios have tried to deliver an ongoing VR esports style shooter, but one of the most short-lived was Nerf Ultimate Championship. Now back in the day, I honestly thought this game could be very successful. The Quest has a younger player base, Nerf is a very well-known product, with an amazing arsenal to pull from, they incorporated some cool wall-running mechanics, and just the concept of turning Nerf into a virtual reality game made plenty of sense and definitely introduced some unique shooter mechanics. I had multiple hours in-game pre-launch, which kept me hopeful, but on release day, the servers went to absolute crap, and it was pretty much just downhill from there. Overall, the game did not last long at all, and this was undeniably a big VR fail. Now on the exact opposite side, when you think VR esports, the first game that should come to mind is Echo VR. Unfortunately though, this title is also cancelled, but more due to politics rather than the game not being successful. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Echo VR or just never tried it, you definitely missed out. It was almost like a zero-G version of rugby, where you have to carry a disc across the stadium and then throw it into a net to score. While this does sound simple enough, it kind of plays out like the flat-screen title Rocket League. It's really easy to understand what to do, but it was an extreme challenge to master this game. Learning how to maneuver with no gravity could be a bit difficult, and after mastering that, there's still some next-level techniques to move on to. I really wish this game was kept alive in some state or form, But all good things do eventually come to an end. Now, speaking of the end, it should have came much sooner for the HTC Vive Cosmos. I'm talking during development, they should have just kiboshed this whole headset. This is back in the days when HTC still mattered to consumers, and many of us were still looking for a cheaper pcvr headset alternative. Unfortunately though, the Cosmos was not the solution. Not only did it start off with an absolutely horrible marketing campaign, but the device was also completely unusable for many people when they finally got their hands on it. HTC's inside-out tracking was absolutely atrocious. It was constantly telling people that their room was too dark to use the headset, even when they had all of their lights on. It also didn't work under some other conditions, like in a green screen room, because the headset couldn't find any distinguishing factors to help anchor itself. Controller tracking was also horrendous and had you changing AA batteries every 2 to 3 hours. And the final insult to anyone who purchased this headset, at launch it didn't work with their game subscription service, Viveport. So all of a sudden you couldn't play the vast majority of games that you already had access to. After owning 16 separate headsets, including 3 from HTC, this one is clearly the worst one I have ever used. Now for the longest time, my favorite VR headset was actually the Valve Index, which to date still delivers the best overall package, but I have to say the biggest win for the VR industry was the Meta Quest. The cost of entry was a major aspect holding back VR, and even if you had no interest in mobile VR, it was still the cheapest way to get into pcvr. Now say what you will about Meta, but we have to acknowledge the fact that this headset was the major turning point for the VR industry. Prior to this, many VR developers were ready to pull out because there was just very little money to be made in pcvr, and the Meta Quest headsets have absolutely changed the game. Now yes, at the same time, it does feel like some games have been knocked back to the Stone Age, and graphical fidelity did take a serious hit for quite some time, but this was the type of reboot that VR truly needed. Now I want to jump back to VR controls for a second, because there's only 2 main aspects that really make VR games unique, and one, it's how immersive they are compared to flat screen gaming, and 2, the different way that you get to interact with the game, usually motion controls. Now some titles just really failed at this, and others gave us unique ways to play that we never thought possible. On the failure side, we have the hero shooter Larcenauts. Now, I personally like this game, but I will say it's like the developers forgot they're making a VR title. Whenever you ran in-game, your hands would move on their own. There was no active or manual reloading, and there really weren't any locomotion or control options that made this title feel like a VR game. Now, I know some of these aspects were patched over time, but overall this felt like a flat-screen hero shooter that could have came out 10 plus years ago. Now, I actually had an even worse issue with a very old pcvr title called Rift VR. This was basically a Rock Band style game with no appealing aspects. Both Rock Band and VR are all about the controls, and this was clearly the weakest aspect of the title. Now on the best side, some games that went all in and gave us mechanics that only truly work in VR include the majority of the rhythm games. Things like Beat Saber, Synth Riders, Drums Rock, Smash Drums, and even Pistol Whip are so good because they're in VR and they only work in VR. Prior to virtual reality, I couldn't really imagine playing games like this, and now they're amongst the best-selling video games. But right now, let's move into our final topic, which are the games that took a huge swing and either struck out or just hit a home run. Now the first one up is Zenith, VR's poster child MMO, which made some massive promises. If you look back to early interviews with Ramen VR, was nothing like the launch title we received. They basically ended up taking old school MMO mechanics and just slapping them into VR. Now in all honesty, the game was a technological achievement, but it just wasn't compelling enough to keep people playing. Additionally, their original concepts, like combat that would mimic Beat Saber, and highly interactive NPCs that would be acting out their own life, never came to fruition, and we got an old school, dumbed down MMO. It also didn't help that the game was buggy, extra grindy, and had no endgame content. Currently, Zenith is failing, and the company has been running at a loss for an extended period of time, so they're really trying to change things up now, split it into almost 2 separate titles, but it doesn't look like that's working out, and I heard it's buggier than ever. Now when it comes to extremely large-scale VR titles that actually did come out great, I obviously have to mention Half-Life Alyx, but that's not the main game I want to talk about. It's undeniable that Alyx has some of the best graphics, an incredible storyline, truly memorable moments, and easily VR's highest production value. But I honestly want to give the win here to Asgard's Wrath 2 for multiple reasons. Honestly, in terms of development cost, it's probably very similar to Half-Life Alyx, as this is a significantly larger game with multiple high-profile voice actors. It also had the significant obstacle of delivering on last generation's mobile chipset. There's not a lot of power to play with on the Quest 2, and the fact that Cinzaro was able to pull off such a robust title is absolutely amazing. So while Half-Life Alyx is the poster child for pcvr, Asgard's Wrath does the same for mobile VR, and I'll honestly say I pumped a lot more hours into Asgard's Wrath 2 than I did with Half-Life Alyx. Okay everybody, that was the best and worst of VR. I'm sure there's other examples out there, so if you have any, drop them in the comments. Obviously there's worse games out there, or maybe a few examples I just forgot because they were so bad I erased them from my memory. So again, let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, thumbs up. If you're new here, consider subscribing. And as always, I'll see you guys on next time.